Kentucky is holding its primaries Tuesday. A number of Democrats are running to face Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell in November. But the race between the top two contenders looks like it's changing in the final days before people vote. For more on this, we want to bring in Daniel Desrochers. He is a political reporter for the Lexington Herald-Leader. Hi there, Daniel. Welcome. Why is this such a tight race?
Well, so it's a tight race mostly because of kind of the events that have happened, right? So there are a lot of factors that probably figure into this. For one, so Amy McGrath got into this race in July, and she has kind of this national brand, this national profile. And so she's been able to attract a ton of money, and that has included the support of the DSCC, of the kind of national Democratic establishment. But there was always a little bit of a soft support for Amy McGrath. She runs as a moderate in Kentucky, and there are a lot of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party who are kind of tired of this same old moderate path that Kentucky Democrats have run for a really long time. And so that kind of created room for State Representative Charles Booker. And he got into the race in January after kind of months of not really being sure about whether or not he was going to jump in. And he really struggled for a long time. And the thing that kind of bolstered and boosted his campaign were these protests over the death of George Floyd, and here in Kentucky, the death of Breonna Taylor. And so that brought him a ton of attention. It brought him a ton of endorsements, and it kind of injected this energy into his campaign that has made it possible for him to really kind of shrink the gap, to pull a lot of the soft McGrath supporters over to his side and make it more of a race.
I want to ask you more about Charles Booker in a moment, but first on Amy McGrath. So she just picked up an endorsement from Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. Earlier this week, he said, quote, "I believe she'll give McConnell a run for his money." You talked about her being a moderate. What issues is she running on?
So she's kind of running on she looks a lot like Joe Biden, really, in terms of the issues that she's running on. So in terms of healthcare, rather than running on a kind of Medicare for all plan, she says, well, we have the Affordable Care Act, we should fix the Affordable Care Act, and we should create something like a public option where people can get a federal health insurance plan. She runs on, so like where some people are kind of for a Green New Deal, she supports more of increasing infrastructure to rural areas of the state, including broadband internet, to try and get them more access and more jobs out there. So she's running kind of the traditional, I guess, moderate kind of path. For example, so she said that she's willing to work with President Donald Trump. She says that, Mitch McConnell has stood in the way of President Trump being able to deliver on things like lowering prescription drug prices and increasing infrastructure. And that has allowed the more progressive candidates to paint her as a pro-Trump Democrat, somebody who is willing to work with the president at a time where a lot of Democrats don't really want to see that.
Yeah, so let's talk about Charles Booker a little bit more. You mentioned how he's had a boosted profile, more elevated public profile in the wake of some of these demonstrations that have taken place across the country, and especially right there, of course, Kentucky, with the death of Breonna Taylor. He said he's raised thousands since June 4th, and a recent 538 poll puts him narrowly ahead of Amy McGrath. So what are his campaign's sort of biggest strengths when you look at the political landscape there in Kentucky right now? It seems to be shifting, as you noted. Right now, what do those strengths appear to be for his campaign?
The biggest strength is that his campaign has always been calling for change now, right? And with COVID-19, with these protests, with everything that's going on in 2020, there are a lot of people who feel like this is a time for urgent change. And that's been the message that he's been delivering since January. So because of that, we kind of have this. So he always talks about his race and his campaign in terms of a movement. He says he's building a movement from Louisville to the hills of Appalachia. And we have this moment that is meeting the movement in a very big way, right? So he's really kind of the candidate that fits what Democrats are looking for in this specific moment.
Well, on Friday, the city of Louisville, as you know, announced an investigation into one of the police officers involved in that deadly shooting of Breonna Taylor. That same day, protesters in support of Charles Booker gathered outside Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's home demanding an end to police brutality. How have demonstrations and the Black Lives Matter movement impacted your traditionally red state?
Well, so where we're tending to see these protests are in Lexington and Louisville. That's where they've been going on for more than 20 days, right? So we're still seeing that in kind of the more urban blue centers of the state. And they have popped up in other parts of the state and more rural parts of the state, places like Irvine, Kentucky, or Murray, Kentucky. And so we're seeing these protests kind of spread. At the same time, they're really tending to be more among the more liberal, younger, more progressive type of people that live in Kentucky. Obviously, Kentucky's a diverse state. There have always been Democrats here, and that's no different than anywhere else. And the way that they're really kind of shaping the race is that, again, they've allowed Charles Booker this platform to really kind of seize the moment. And he has been on the front lines in Louisville. He's been at protests in Lexington. He's been at protests in smaller rural counties. And it was really telling. I mean, that was one of the big moments that kind of shifted, I think, some people's attention. There was one televised debate on Kentucky educational television, and Charles Booker had just come from basically an impromptu memorial for a man named David McAtee, who was shot by a National Guard member when they were called in to help the Louisville police earlier in the protest. And so he had come from that. He had come from being tear gassed the night before, and he was talking about this issue with genuine sincerity. And you had the two other major candidates who had not been to the protest yet and who kind of struggled to kind of come up with an answer, a kind of more moderate answer on Amy McGrath's end on how to kind of navigate this really tenuous moment in America.
That's really fascinating to hear about that dynamic. We'll continue to watch closely to see how things play out. Daniel Desrochers. Daniel, thanks very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.